Okay, so for those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Richard Scott Noakes. I'm a professor here at Troy University. And to give you a little background of what our little video is today, I am teaching a class in folklore and mythology at the moment. And one of the things that we are reading for this is the Sunjata epic. And Julius Bamataraki, who is uh, the cabinet minister for culture, information technology. I got that wrong. For Bwamba in Uganda, he can correct me when he starts talking. Agreed to talk to my students. We couldn't exactly get that scheduled properly, and so at the request of my students, he's generously agreed to do a recorded thing that they can then watch after the fact about the Sunjata. Um, and immediately, some of you might be thinking, like, well, wait a second. If he's in Uganda and the Sunjata is West African, why is he there? And the truth is, because we're doing myth and folklore once over very lightly, we kind of vaguely treat all European, we act like Russian folklore and French folklore is the same, or North American folklore and Central American folklore are the same. We kind of lump them all together while being very knowing that they're not all the same, right? In any way. But anyway, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Professor. I am very grateful for this opportunity.
So I wanted to first just talk a little bit about um, the regional background. So uh, this is usually associated with the Mali Empire, which would be further west from, certainly further west from, further west from Uganda. Although your particular kingdom in Uganda, as I understand, is on the west side. So when you like immediately when you look at this, do you think of this as something which is, culturally resonant with you, or does this feel like a foreign work for you?
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Professor. Maybe just to correct you a little bit, I am the Cabinet Minister for Research, ICT, and Documentation
I got
in
it
the
all wrong.
Budinga
I got
Ramba.
it all wrong.
Yeah, which is that's okay. To I is human. Thank you. Now, I just and I agree with you that we sometimes have this tendency to put things together. I think there is a lot of commonalities, especially in Africa. So in as much as the geographical locations are different, there is actually pretty much in common in terms of, for example, culture, life, and even politics. So in as much as this is a story about ancient West African kingships, I think there is a lot that resonate with the way the traditions I come from go about business. So I find so many similarities. And for example, I'm lucky that in terms of our tradition here, my grandfather actually, the father of my mom, my mother, was one of the person who fought for our current society there. So initially we're under Toro Kingdom. I think I shared that in one of the discussion we had. And then of course, one thing about kingdoms is that every time a kingdom is under, so if a kingdom sort of like, because I saw this one also happen even in the ancient Greek kingdoms. For example, where I see this loose alliance between, for example, Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, Ithaca, and so on and so forth. In as much as they're going to form a loose alliance, in most cases, when the kingdoms are not under the same tribes, there is always something that emerges. Chaos and conflicts come. And so what happened is when we were under the Toro kingdom, because we were not Batolo, so we couldn't be a king, we could never produce a king, or we're simply subjects and servants there. So my grandfather had to ally a certain section of those who felt they were marginalized in that particular kingdom, and they decided to fight for their own rights. And that gave rise now to two districts, one of Bundibujo, where I come from, and then the neighboring one is Kasese. And now those districts have since gone on to have their own cultural institutions. So particularly, I come from the Obdinga Wamba Cultural Institution, for which now I am very honored to serve as a cabinet minister. So I find so many similarities between what I find in West African kingship and also maybe what we live. Of course, there are also very many differences because, for example, our king is a constitutional monarch. He has rights and he can also be charged in case he transgressed on law and so on and so. But they are pretty much the same thing. So the West African story is pretty much my story as well.
So let's talk a little bit about genre. This particular edition I have here, which was an old Penguin Classics, is called the Sunjata Story. It's often called the Sunjata Epic. Uh, but uh, but sometimes we just tend to lump together all these kinds of sagas and epics. Anything that's a long poem, we kind of lump together. But this is a very particular kind of genre. I wonder. I guess it's called the Fossa. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and talk about how it's similar and how it's different from what people might expect if they're coming to look at an epic.
All right, thank you. The particular version I've read, I think it's titled Sundiata, an epic of old Mali. I think that's called by great Jerry Mamoudou Koyate. It was initially written in French by a gentleman called Ibril Tamsa Niani, I think who was a Guinean playwright and author. And then, of course, translated into English by G.D. Pickett, 1965. That's the version I'm reading, which might be different from probably yours. But what I find this particular epic, because I've also read this semester, I'm teaching classical poetry, which is essentially epic poetry to the second year students here at Chamberlain University, in the Department of Literature and Film Studies. So I'm teaching them, I think, 6 epics. I'm teaching Hesiod. I think that's in the Theogony. I'm also teaching the 2 Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Virgil's the Aeneid, and Dante's the Divine Comedy. So I've read much. Of course, I've also previously read like the English epics, like Beowulf now. I've also the Fairy Queen. I've also read, I think the one of John Milton, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and other epics. So I have a long, I think I have something to do with epics, and I feel like it's a fascinating genre of literature. And I find so many similarities and differences. Now, but most of the similarities, I think I have gotten them into 2 categories. So I am awestruck because I've just recently read it, by the way. I'm urging, I've never read it before. When you asked me that you want me to talk to class about it, I felt fascinated. But I was also very much interested in finding if this particular West African epic probably has almost some of the things that you will find in other epics, which I found actually recurring. So I was very much intrigued by 2 things. One, when it comes to the question of subject matter, and also to this question of style, I find that this particular West African epic fits very well in the category of epic genre. So, for example, if you read the Homeric epics, especially starting with the Iliad epic, the Iliad, you'll find that the subject matter is about warfare, and of course, it's a devastating conflicts with the end of the fall of Troy. I find actually similar things recounted in this particular epic. Of course, the founding of Mali, the great Mali Empire, is based on conquest, where there's a lot of bloodshed, and there is going to be so many ordeals. The epic hero undergoes so many challenges, pretty much like you find in the Homeric epic. Now, when it comes to the style of writing, the style is, although there could be different differences here and there, the style here is equally grand. So, in terms of, for example, you find lofty language style, the hyperboles are there, contrast, epithets, of course, in the African realm, and then the genealogy of the kings of the Mali Empire. So I find there are so many similarities, although there are also striking differences as well.
Well, let's start with the similarities. Let's start with the universal. Like
All right.
what are the things that you see in this that seem maybe not universal in every work, but we see archetypically across cultures, across time?
Yeah, thank you. So quite many of them, like again, my discussion of the similarities and also the differences, I want them reduced to in a twofold. So on the question of subject matter, what do the Greek epics deal with? Most of them, I think, like the Iliad, for example, maybe I should be drawing inferences in there, because I find the similarities are much more reflected in the Iliad than probably any other epic that I've read. So, for example, the question of war. The Iliad you look at, for instance, the Iliad centers is based on the Trojan War, the war that lasts for 10 years, although the epic will now center on the last few days of the war. We know with the war has been taking place for the last 9 years. So probably in the ninth year, that's when the story becomes much more serious. And so, and of course, one of them is the cause of this war, of course, which is pretty much different from the one, although we also have some reminiscences of the same thing. Because there is a gentleman in here whom I'm going to refer to, also was very much aggrieved by the decision of his uncle to take away his wife, which sort of like mirrors the story you have of Menelaus and Paris, the elopement of Helen, and so on and so forth. So the question of war, for example, and how devastating this war becomes, and how empires, once famous, can actually be ravaged by war. For example, Troy falls, now what becomes of the Trojans, now what happens to the Greeks, and so on and so forth. Now here I find, for example, I think this particular one, and maybe one of the differences as I'll later on look at, is that this is part legendary and also part history. Maybe that's the major difference. But here, in terms of, for example, the epic, we know that this is a story which sort of like recounts the extraordinary founding of the great empire, okay, and how one person is going to unite the 12 states or the 12 tribes of Mali and then unite them as one empire, of course, through conquest and war and so on and so forth. Then we also find that this is not going to be an easy deed. So the hero is going to go through a series of challenges and ordeals, which I think is normally the standard of epic heroes.
Yeah.
And first of all, how is the hero born? The mother is a hunchback, so the odds are pretty much against him. It's going to take him so many years to actually be able to stand and walk by himself. It's going to be, a source of public derision. I think the stepmother is going to make fun of the mother and so on and so forth. He's going to be forced out of his own kingdom, even when the father had bequeathed him the kingdom. He's going to be welcomed some places going to be chased away. So it's going to be a very bumpy ride, pretty much like the ones you find in the Iliad and the other epics. And so I find that, the journey motif in there. I also find that the aspect of war and how devastating that war is, and also what the ordeals that the epic hero goes through is an aspect of universal similarity, and that's actually what you find also in the previous epics, especially the ones written by Homer and others, the classical epics. Now, when it comes to the question of style, the style is equally almost the same. Of course, there are differences in there. So the language is predominantly lofty. So this is not commonplace language. So you have the description of, for example, the epic in terms of the deeds he's able to accomplish. It's much more hyperbolic. And then there are so many contrasts in there. You have issues to do with the allusions, and then epithets, the description is descriptive adjectives, and then the genealogy of the various leaders of this great Mali empire. So in terms of style and subject matter, I find that this particular epic follows the tradition of even the greatest epics, especially the ones written by Homer and the like.
Yeah, and even some things that at one point seem particular, maybe are not as particular as they might appear first glance. So one thing that I often note when I'm looking at uh, at uh, cultures that practice monogamy, monogamous marriages, is you have to have the evil stepmother. And when we have almost the same folktale coming from polygamous culture, it doesn't have to be, it could be the first wife, or it could be another wife, who is of your father, who's doing whatever the evil deed is that they have to do. So it seems very particular. And then when you think about it, well, no, it's actually the exact same thing, just looked at um, through a different lens. You started talking about style, and I hadn't told you I was going to ask about this, but I'll ask anyway. One of the really important, um, I guess, intellectual contributions that has come out of Uganda is the idea of thinking about orature as maybe a distinct way of looking at oral literature. Um, what are some ways that you would suggest to my students and maybe anyone else who's watching this, uh, that they might think about oral literature more as orature instead?
All right. There is no much clear-cut difference between orature and oral literature. I think the word orature, I'm sure you've come across that, was coined by a Ugandan literary scholar, Pio Zirimu. But essentially, it's the same as oral literature, works of literature that are simply orally transmitted. That's what he meant to say. And I think he probably wanted to Ugandanize the aspect of oral literature. I think the idea was that oral literature could be situational. So a particular society might have its own view of what oral literature is. So I think for Uganda's case, it is very plausible to mention. Sorry, please. So it is very important that so you can talk about oral literature, but now in the context of what he calls orature. Now, orature is simply the same as oral literature. So I think you want outside Uganda, orature might not make so much sense. I think oral literature might be the thing. So the question of orature is predominantly Ugandan probably, but it essentially is about all those different oral performances. So you have the folk tales, you have the proverbs, you have the fables, you have the what have you, and so on and so forth. So essentially that's how it is. Now, but for the students, I think what they need to look at is maybe they should look at these oral performances, especially the African or the Ugandan oral performances in terms of the genre. African oral performances, Ugandan oral performances are subdivided. For example, you have the short formulaic forms, the ones. So I think the best way to study African oral literature, especially Ugandan orature, you look at it in terms of genres. So you have the oral performances, you have the prose narratives, and also you have the elegies. So for example, you have the legends, the myths as under prose narratives, which is of course now a part of oral literature. And then you have the short formulaics, like the proverbs and wise sayings, the riddles, the tongue twisters, so on and so forth. And then, of course, there are the song poems. Now, the recitals, the way you have the recitations, the elegies. So you have those particular things. So oral literature becomes the way I think Zerim looks at it. It makes it look like sort of like a complete literature of its own.
Yeah.
So where you have different subgenres in there. So you have within oral literature, you have like I've mentioned, you have the prose, you have the short form lyrics, and also the performative part of it in terms of, for example, those songs. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that is lost, necessarily lost in written literature, is that immediacy of performance. I mean, we see this when we're looking at drama, right? We had a discussion in another one of my classes about some particular lines that Desdemona says in Othello, and how those lines are performed could radically change not just the way you understand that scene, but the way you understand that entire reading. And when you're looking at something that's oral literature, if you're reading it in a class, you're reading it on out of the page, and so you have to hear it in your own voice in some way. But every performance of this is going to be a unique work of orature, right? Every time. And so if you were to go to, if you were to hear someone perform this or read this aloud, maybe in an audiobook versus go to a live performance at like the famous Indira Center, there in Uganda, those might in some ways be entirely different experiences, more than just hearing a different voice, really a different understanding of the text itself. I wonder if you,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, it's okay, Prof. Sorry, I just checked it. You go on the question.
So we've been talking about the universality, and that's the kind of thing that my class has mostly been focused on because it's once over very lightly around the world, all sorts of cultures, and they're kind of struggling with the shockingness of something from pre-Columbian Central America, sharing a lot with, something from, Qing Dynasty China or whatever, right? It's just very, they kind of understood it, but as they're reading through it, it's surprising. But all of these things also have their own particularity. And so what are things that are really particular about this that might inform the universals, but also might just be something about this particular text?
Yeah, that's a very important question because in as much as it belongs to the wide genre of epic poetry, there are also the West African bit of it, or the African bit of it. And for example, again, also the particularities in terms of the two things I mentioned, the subject matter and also the style. So for example, if you look at the question of style, uh, most epics, they would start, for instance, with an epic invocation. So poetry writing, I think, according to the Greeks and the Romans, they felt that you needed to be inspired by the muses. Those ones don't seem to happen in here. So the story starts with the griot. So the griot is going to introduce himself, and he's not going to tell us that he's inspired by anyone, but he's going to sort of like present himself as the quintessential, the master narrator, whether
So, so,
inspired.
so I'm sorry to interrupt. If people are watching this after the fact, many people might not know what a griot is. So
Right.
before you go any further, can you kind of give us a quick definition of it?
Okay, so the griot here, and this particular poem, by the way, celebrates the centrality of griots in African culture, history, and even folklore. So the griots are the storytellers and the keepers of African history. And from the way the version I read, I think every king that you encounter has his own griot. The person is going to recount the extraordinary deeds and so on and so forth. So these are the master storytellers, call them the bards. These are like the oral Shakespeare's of this particular society. Those are the griots, yeah.
And they have a kind of particular social standing that comes with that.
Yeah, of course, because they're going to say with the kings, they will live at the courts. They are not common people, and they are the chief advisors of the kings. So they are in a way respected.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I interrupted to get you to define griots. So you were making a broader point about griots in this.
All right. So now the question of the particularity, I think that's what I was driving at. So, and that was very important because the griot indeed are very important here. So when you look at, for example, as I've already mentioned, the Greek epic poem, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they will all start with a divine invocation, with the invocation of the muses. So we don't see that here. So here the story is going to start with the narrator himself. He's not going to say he's inspired by any other person, but he's also going to project himself as this person who is the custodian of the history, of the culture of a given society. And then you also see the chronology of the narrative. There is nothing medias res here. So the action is not going to start in the middle. And the story will simply start from the start, the middle, and then take you to the beginning. So there is a clear chronological narrative style. And then also you will find that this story, this particular one that you're reading, it might not pass majorly as verse, especially the version I read. I don't know you as professor, the one you read. Mine is Remenu, a Sunjata, an epic of old Mali. I felt like the language is much more prosaic than verse.
Mhm.
And that again is a clear difference. But also in terms of size, this is a very short story. Actually, it will take you like two hours. But the Greek ones, they will take you a couple of days to read them because they're bulky and so on and so forth. And then I think the reason why the size probably has to be smaller, people always sometimes pejoratively think that the African person is predominantly an orate person. So maybe reading might not be much their thing. I think that has changed, of course, somehow. But it was presumed those days that maybe make the story shorter so that people can be able to read it. They might not have time to waste reading a big, voluminous volume like the one you find in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then when it comes to the question of the narrator, I think the narrator lives with other people. So this griot is going to be a common person, so that whatever they are going to say, it is essentially about things that people are familiar with. And then you also know some story within story style in this one. There's an inside narration. So you have the main storyteller, but also there are other people who are going to recount events that have happened, and which brings in the question of communality in African oral storytelling methods. So the story does not have to be told by one particular narrator, like you have Homer recount the entire Iliad and the Odyssey, but here you will find in the Sunjata epic, the griot is going to talk, but there are other narrators who will also narrate a few other things that you find here. And of course, there is a great usage of elements of the African oral tradition. For example, wise sayings, uh, aspects of, for example, so you have jinn, which I think is an Islam thing, something to do with the demons. And then you have things to do with the sorcery. I don't know if there is sorcery in America, but it looks like this, and here it doesn't carry any pejorative connotation. I think it's something the griot sort of like celebrates and worships. And then there are aspects of African magic, even witchcraft, and without their pejorative connotation. So I think these are part of it, which essentially somehow you'll find probably similar narratives, but not so much like you'll find in it. So there is an aspect of an Africanized style of the narration that you find in an epic poem of this particular magnitude. Then, of course, there are common things, everyday things that affect a common African family. So things to do with, for example, polygamous families and the question of the struggles and the jealousy between co-wives, and sometimes, and that's highly pronounced. And the professor also come from a polygamous family. I think my dad had two wives, and these days we get on well with my families, probably because I have made it in life. But there are also instances where the co-wife, especially if you are siblings from the other mother, have not made it well in life. There is that bit of jealousy and that hatred. So we see that particular part of it, and we don't see those things. For example, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are common things about African life and what really happens. There are not so many things of like supernatural life, like these grand things of monsters and so on that we read in the format. These are everyday things, and I feel that's what makes this particular story an African and not probably a universal story.
You know, a lot of you were talking about magic, and a lot of the thinkers over the last couple centuries who've thought about the relationships between sometimes folk tales and sometimes epics have often, or sorry, myth is what I'm really looking at here, have wondered like and have worked with the question of like, well, what's the relationship between this and philosophy? What's the relationship between this and religion? Is this a kind of religion? Does it lead to religion? You know, and these kinds of questions, and they have a tendency in there to kind of lump everything together. But you know, you do make an interesting point about the magic being a kind of everyday thing. So, for example, something supernatural happens in a Mediterranean, you know, like a Greek myth, and the idea is, well, the gods are upset, or this god has more power than that god, or this kind of thing, right? Whereas what we see a lot more of, I think, in Africa and in some other cultures too, myth and folktale is the idea that the sorcerer doesn't just have a weakness, but has like something particular to that person. Kind of like similar, maybe a little similar to Samson, though even that, his hair being cut was connected to him being Levite, but like that this particular sorcerer has this weakness that doesn't necessarily, it's very particular to this person. And then magic becomes very individualistic rather than just this god is mad at me or I have an inherent power, or, or there's some mystical forces that we all can tap into if we only know how, if we only have the knowledge.
Yeah, I think the last point you just made is very interesting because these are sort of like, which is pretty again like the way you mentioned, because if you look at it, if you to go by the example, for instance, the Iliad, you see the gods themselves are sort of like anthropomorphic. So they have this corporeal nature. They have a tendency to behave like human beings. So they take sides, for example, there are those in favor of the Trojans and those in favor of the Greeks. And so sort of like the gods now cease to be universal gods, like the different, of course, maybe with the exception of Zeus, who can sometimes give favors to both sides depending on maybe what he intends to achieve. But we will see the Olympian gods themselves also were sort of like individual. Like for example, uh, you have Athena, you have Hera on the side of the Greeks, and then you have Apollo and maybe Poseidon on the Greek on the side of the Trojans, and so on and so forth. That's almost the same thing that we find in here. So we find, for example, the last person especially, and there is a striking reminiscence on how this epic ends. So which sort of like reminds us of the one-on-one combat between Achilles and Hector, this battle fought by Sunjata himself and Somolu, the last person whom he engages in a one-on-one combat, and how he finally defeats him and then becomes part of it. So we see the magic he has, sort of like even when he's a king, this magic is sort of like personal magic. It's not going to benefit any other person. In fact, the magic sort of like becomes even a big problem to the rest of the people of Soso, for example. So this magic is it's nothing, it doesn't even belong to all the people of Soso, but it's only for Somoro himself. And I feel like the universal part of it is something you can tap in, but it looks like how much attachment you have to particular mythical powers, which is, I think, it's an obscure and somewhat mysterious aspect, actually. So, in a way, it also becomes an aspect of philosophy. It is not clear cut, so you really can't tell. Maybe those who do anthropology can actually tap so much into that one. But I find the sort of magic, the sorcery, but also you realize that almost all the characters that have central roles in this particular epic all have magical powers. They have that power. They don't invoke the gods like you find in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but you have each one of them has been oriented into the world of magic and sorcery. And so the fighting becomes sort of like difficult. These are almost all of them are can be powerful. Maybe it's going to depend on whose magic or whose sorcery is going to outweigh the other person, and that is the person who will take the day. And good enough, it's for Sunjata, and I think it looks like all the odds are in his favor, and that's how he manages to end well by establishing this great Mali empire.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but before we
All
go,
right.
I just want to say to the viewers who are not in my class, though I guess people in my class also can chime in on this if they want. So we've been talking, the two of us have been talking sort of, we've had a couple of these conversations. We've been talking about should we do a series where we just pick a different book and just have a back and forth about it? But we're both very, very busy people, so we don't want to do it if no one's interested in it. If it's just for us, although I do enjoy these conversations.
Yeah.
If you'd like to hear more of just us walking through, I've just been rereading the Aeneid, and so everything. It was hard for me not to go off and talk about the Aeneid when we were
Yeah.
talking. When you were talking about Homer, I guess Virgil wrote the Aeneid, but it's hard for me not to go off in that direction. So if you're watching this after the fact, and this is something you'd really like to see a series where we go through a bunch of different books and just have a conversation. Actually, even less directed than what we have today, comment below, and if we can find the time, we'll do it. You've got two jobs at the moment, right? You're a cabinet minister and a faculty member at Chambogo University there in Uganda. And I've got a couple hats I'm wearing as well. But if that's something you're interested in, please let us know.
All right.
Julius Bamutaraki of the University of Chambogo University, I want to thank you so much for just giving my students this gift today and for allowing me to share it with anyone else who's interested.
It's a big pleasure, Professor, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.